what we're going to do today in Mitzvah Hashem, aside from finish the cake, is we are going to take a closer look at the Shema. We mentioned it yesterday. We talked about it yesterday. Today we'll have a look inside and see what we've got over here. Just at the beginning, I mean, first of all, these are paragraphs that are coming out of the Torah. The first thing that we begin saying is, like we mentioned yesterday, a declaration, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We talk about God being one. God is the only entity that can be described as one. If you take a look inside of the Sefer Torah, there's an interesting thing. The last letter of the word Shema is an ayin, and the last letter of the word Echad, which is the last word in the sentence, is a daled, and they're written bigger. The emphasis here in the Siddur, you can see the ayin and the daled have been written bigger as well. In the Sefer Torah, it's written like that, so you know it's easy to see it. Ayin and daled together spell out the word aid, which is a witness, which means that when we come to recite the Shema, when we come to declare Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we're serving witness to the fact that God is is everything, right? Pardon?
Omnipotent.
Thank you. The omnipotent one. That was very biblical of you.
Thank you.
So we're coming over here. We're coming to give testimony to that idea, to that fact. The first verse, the first paragraph of the Shema, which we'll look at in Mitzvah Hashem shortly, is talking about accepting upon ourselves God's heavenly yoke, what's called Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, accepting upon ourselves the yoke that God is King. Again, what we need is to understand that if God is King, then we really ought to do what God wants us to do, right? I mean, as a rule, if you've got some kind of a kingship, some kind of a rulership, then it makes sense to do what that rulership wants you to do in order that you don't end up in places that you don't want to be. So even inside of so-called democracies, you should really do what the government wants you to do, because otherwise you're going to end up in jail. I mean, if they can catch you, right? When you live in more despotic regions, it becomes even more extreme and becomes even more obvious that doing what you're supposed to do is going to keep you safe, and not doing what you're supposed to do is going to make life very difficult for you. The word Shema itself, Shin Mem Ayin, when you flip it around, it becomes an acronym for Ol Malchut Shamayim, which means accepting upon yourself the heavenly yoke. And I think the idea over here is that why does it need to be, why is it back to front? I think the answer is that sometimes we have to get through something in order to be able to look back and understand it properly. And over here as well, we're going to work our way through the Shema, and by the time we get to the end of it, we'll understand the reasons why it's correct to accept upon ourselves God's heavenly yoke. Perhaps before we go any further, maybe a little insight into the idea of a yoke. It's interesting that the rabbis talk about accepting the heavenly yoke. They talk about accepting the yoke of the commandments as well. You would have thought that if they were trying to come up with a word that was going to describe the majesty and the beauty both of God and the commandments, you would have thought that perhaps they could come up with something a little bit more exciting than a yoke. A yoke, again, we're not talking about the yellow of the egg, you realize that, yeah. The yoke, Y-O-K-E, is something that, it's heavy, it's a burden, it's placed on top of the animal. That's how you harness an animal, that's how you get an animal to be able to plow your field. You have to place a yoke over its neck, and then you can attach the various bits and pieces that go together with it, and then you can use it to plow your field. Why on earth would the rabbis use a phrase like a yoke to describe keeping the mitzvahs, keeping the commandments, and accepting God's majesty over us? Why would they do that? It seems like a rather negative thing to do. But the truth of the matter is like this: that without a yoke, you have no way of being able to utilize the strength of your ox. Which means if you want to plow your field without putting the yoke on the neck of the animal, you're not going to be able to get that field plowed, because you're not going to be able to utilize the strength that the ox has got. In the same way, the rabbis are teaching us something very fundamental, that we we are not able to utilize our spiritual strength unless we allow ourselves to be guided and to be channeled and have our strength channeled into the correct direction. And that's exactly what the yoke does. Which means like this, that somebody who's not interested in having this yoke, it's going to be a burden and they're going to spend the rest of their time trying to get rid of it and trying to throw it off of them. But for somebody who recognizes that the positives I mentioned of what the yoke is doing, then at that point, these people now have the ability to be able to utilize their strengths and to be able to channel them into the direction they need to go in order to become the people that they need to become. The truth is, it's really no different. What we're learning over here is really no different from any kind of, any kind of something that somebody wants to go into, anything that somebody wants to succeed at is going to require taking upon yourself a regimen that's going to let you succeed at what you want to do. And that's going to come at the expense of other things that you want to do. It's as simple as that. There's no two ways about it. So here, for example, you're talking about wanting to go along the, what's it called?
Appalachian Trail.
The Appalachian Trail. And, doing that means if it's going to take 6 months to get from one end to the other, that means that you're going to have to give up on all kinds of things within that 6 months in order to be able to achieve your goal of having been able to do that. And that means that you're going to accept upon yourself the yoke of going along the Appalachian Trail. Again, it's a yoke, it's a burden. Somebody else who doesn't like to do these things will look and think that you're crazy. Other people that love to do these things will look and say, wow, I wish I could do that. But it comes down to what you're prepared to do and what you're not prepared to do. Yeah.
In the world of economics, if you're studying as a subject, that is called opportunity cost. What the price you pay for spending 6 months hiking, all the things that you can't be doing as a result. It's called opportunity cost.
Opportunity costs. Okay, good, right? I mean, I think opportunity cost is something which fits into almost everything that we do. And even if somebody dedicates his life to not doing anything at all, that also has an opportunity cost because it means that they're not doing anything in the meantime. They're not fulfilling anything.
That'd be a very boring life.
For sure. I read years and years ago. I read they interviewed in South America. There was a fellow who escaped from prison, and he went out into he was out in the jungles. And he was actually, he escaped for quite a while. I can't remember how long, but many months he was on the run.
From where?
From some South American prison. I can't remember the country even, but I just remember that the things that he said were quite fascinating. They captured him, they finally recaptured him, and they brought him back, and he was being interviewed for some kind of a newspaper, and they asked him, what did he do? I mean, he was out for months, he was out, right? So they asked him, what did he do? So he said he was out in the jungles, and he was living, first of all, he had to sleep in the trees, because he was scared of the animals down at the bottom, and he was scared that if he was asleep, he wouldn't be able to hear the animals coming, and they might make a little bit of breakfast out of him. And secondly, he couldn't light fires very often because he was scared that the smoke would be detected from above, right? They were still looking for him. And he subsisted on all kinds of rather, I don't know what you people feel about these things, but I don't think they sound very interesting, certainly don't sound very tasty. He subsisted on bugs. He subsisted on smaller animals, things that, little things that he could catch. And when they asked him, why did he do that? Why didn't he just stay in prison and finish up his sentence and then leave? And so he said, it was an interesting phrase. He said, well, out there I was free. Now, I don't know, I think the definition of freedom is something which is a little bit open to interpretation. I'm not sure that somebody out in the jungle who can't live a normative lifestyle, I'm not sure, is that really the definition of being free? The chances are that in prison, he was probably being more constructive. I imagine in prison they make them do things, whether it's, making license plates or sewing mailbags. I don't even know if people have mailbags anymore, actually. But they do. Yeah, I don't know what they put in them. But, oh, yeah? Interesting. But the idea is, isn't it a fascinating thing that a person can be in jail and be living a much more constructive lifestyle than somebody who's out free, in inverted commas? What are we bringing upon ourselves? What are we trying to do over here? I read, just to give you a little idea, I think I've mentioned this in the past, but to give you an idea of just what a sad kid I was, really sad and pathetic, and I know you're going to say that nothing has changed, and it's true, except for my age. I'm not a kid anymore, but I read, there was a fellow called Mark Spitz, Jewish kid from California, who up until the last Olympics held the Olympic record for winning the most amount of gold medals in one Olympics. In the 1974 Olympics in Munich, he won 7 gold medals for swimming. This guy was, absolutely brilliant. And I read a little bit. He wrote a biography. So it gives you an idea just how sad I am. I mean, why would anybody read a biography of a swimmer? I've no idea. We got in the water and it was wet, and we swam from one side of the pool to the other. And then, the next chapter is, and we got into the water and it was wet and we swam around. But he says over there that you can imagine he was growing up as a teenager in California at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. Now you can imagine what that means, right? For those of you that have any idea of, what was happening, American history in the 60s and the 70s, it was a very, what would be the best way to describe this? It was a very interesting era, no doubt about it. And of course, he couldn't do anything that his friends were doing. He was on this incredibly strict regimen of going to train. He was in school, so when he finished school, he had to go to train. And after training, he wasn't allowed to eat what everyone else was eating. He could eat only certain foods, and he had to go to bed by a certain time. Everybody else was out doing whatever they wanted to do, however they wanted to do it. And he was left, just swimming. And training and swimming and training. He said there were many times on the way that he wanted to give up. But he had a coach who wouldn't let go of him. And he said when he stood on the podium to receive his first gold medal at that Olympics, he realized that it was all worth it. At that point, he realized that it was all worth it. Everything, all those years of sacrifice that he'd poured into becoming the best swimmer in the world, all of that became worthwhile on the first medal that he received. Of course, by the time, I don't remember, I don't think I got to the end of the book where it talks about the 7th medal that he got, but you can imagine, right, the idea of accepting upon yourself a yoke. You're accepting upon yourself something that's going to direct you, something that's going to allow you to succeed. It's true in everything that we do, every single thing, and it's true in Judaism as well. Which means that if a person wants to succeed at being Jewish, if a person wants to become a successful Jew, so they need to accept upon themselves the yoke of keeping the commandments and the yoke of accepting God as the king in order to be able to become who they need to become. Right? Again, to put it into easy to understand analogies, I have a brother who's a surgeon. And I remember at the beginning of his, we finished his studies and he went into what's it called when you intern, right? He became an intern, and the hours were crazy, and it was ridiculous. And he was working 36-hour shifts, and then coming home, sleeping for a little bit, and then going back to the hospital again. And it was unbelievable what was going on. But at the end of all of this, what happens? You come out, you're qualified, you are ready to start your career in the way that, the best possible way that you can. And that's the only way to do it. Does that come at a sacrifice to other things that a person might want to do? Of course it does. It's very difficult for a person to be able to do everything that he wants to do. There's an interesting insight. There's a Mishnah in Ethics of the Fathers. It describes somebody who's rich. It says, Ezu Ashir, who's a rich person? Asamer b'chelko, somebody who's happy with what he's got. It's interesting. I mean, first of all, it's an interesting insight that wealth is not being described according to, bless you, wealth is not being described according to how much money you've got or how much real estate you've got. It's being described according to your state of mind. Right? Somebody is wealthy is somebody who is happy with what he's got. Rav Chaim Volozhiner, one of the foremost personalities from about 180 years ago, he was the closest student of the great Vilna Gaon back in Lithuania. He writes, Hasamer b'chelko, somebody who's happy with his chelik is somebody who knows that he's only going to achieve some of what he wants to achieve, then he's able to be happy. But somebody who imagines that he's going to be able to achieve everything that he wants to do, then he's never going to be happy, because it's really not something that can be done. And if I want to do one thing, then it's going to come at the expense of the second thing. And if I decide that I want to do the second thing, it's going to come at the expense of the first thing. And that's just the way that it goes. When we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, when we recite the Shema, what we're doing is we're accepting upon ourselves that we are prepared to make the sacrifices required in order to be able to draw closer to God, in order to be able to live our lives according to the way that God wants us to live them. And that's really the significance, the idea of saying aid, that we become witnesses, we're giving testimony to the fact that we're prepared to do that. There is an interesting, the sages say, an interesting little insight over here into why the Dalet is big in Echad, because I don't know if you're familiar with Hebrew letters, but a Dalet and a Reish are very similar to each other. The only difference between the two is that the Reish has a rounded corner up on the top, and the Dalet has an angular corner. And if a person were to read Echad with a Reish instead of a Dalet, it would come out as Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. Hashem Acher, the Lord is somebody else, which is I don't know, a little bit heretical, I guess, right? So the Dalet is written big in order that we shouldn't come to make a mistake. However, the sages also say something very beautiful, which is that if somebody makes a mistake when they're reciting Hebrew, they make a mistake and they say things in a mistaken fashion, so long as they did it because they weren't aware of the correct way to say it, then God will listen to their prayers and God will accept them for whatever they were supposed to be. Which means that if somebody makes a genuine mistake and he says over here, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Acher, and he makes a somewhat heretical statement that God is somebody else, then if he meant to say Echad and he mispronounced it, then that's fine. God will accept the prayer for what it was supposed to be. Which means God peeks into your heart and sees what's going on over there. So the whole of the first paragraph, the Shema is split up into 3 paragraphs. We mentioned that yesterday. The whole of the first paragraph of the Shema is revolving around the concept of, again, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, accepting upon ourselves the heavenly yoke, and it talks about love. V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, that you should love the Lord your God. Right? How do you love somebody? Anybody know? It's complete and absolute silence.
You give.
You give. Thank you. How do you show somebody that you love them? You give to them. Right? It's not enough, within a relationship, everybody here I'm sure is absolutely perfectly aware that within a relationship, it's not enough to just imagine that the person that you're in the relationship with knows that you love them. You have to show them that you love them, right? How do you show them that you love them? You tell them that you love them. You can buy them, little gifts, for example, things that they've always wanted. So, for example, maybe, like a new tire for the car, or, that kind of thing. But that's how you show somebody that you love somebody. V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, we're commanded to love God. How are we supposed to show God that we love Him?
Tell
him. you could tell him, right? Which means that you could go outside and you could sort of shout up into the sky, I love you, and you could keep doing that until they come to take you away. Right? That's one possibility. There was a famous bit of graffiti. It says, if you speak to God, then you're pious, and if God speaks to you, then you're schizophrenic. So I'm not quite sure, standing out in the garden outside, screaming "I love you" up into the sky, I'm not sure which one that falls into exactly, but you could definitely do that. The other alternative, which is perhaps a little less socially awkward, shall we say, is to do the mitzvahs, right? God wants us to keep the commandments. How do we show God that we love Him? By doing what He wants us to do. So, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, we'll do whatever we can do. You don't have to do them all. It would be nice if we were able to do them all, right? But a person can take upon themselves, mitzvot and commandments, and they like this one, so they'll do this one. They'll like that one. They'll do that one. The other one is too difficult for them right now, so they won't do it. But the idea is showing God that you are that you are prepared to do what he wants you to do. That's your way of showing God that you love him. And then it says like this, B'chol levavecho v'chol nafshecho v'chol moedecho. A very interesting little phrase over here, how we're supposed to show God that we love him. We're supposed to show him with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our resources. Now, it's getting a little detailed, but I want you to hear this because it's a very beautiful idea. Something very, very deep is coming up. Uvachol levavecha, the word that levavecha is spelled lamed bet bet chaf. And the rabbis point out that that's not the way to spell heart. Your heart should be libcha, lamed bet chaf. There's an extra bet over there. Now we need to know what that is because again, in the Torah, there's no such thing as a letter that's there for no reason. There's no such thing as a letter that's been missed out for no reason. Everything has to be learned. So the Gemara, the Talmud learns something very, very interesting over here. It says, that we should serve God with shnei yitzarecha, with both of your inclinations. What inclinations have we got? So we've got a Yetzer HaTov, we've got a good inclination, and we've got a Yetzer Hara, and we've got a bad inclination. Right? Some of you may not have been aware of the fact that you've got a good inclination, but you do. Right? Everybody's got. The Gemara is coming along over here to teach us something very, very fascinating. I'm not sure anyone's picked up on it yet, though. The Gemara says that we should serve God b'chol levavecha, with both of your inclinations, which is coming to teach us what? That our task over here in this world is not to uproot the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and to get rid of it. Rather, our task in this world is to take the power of the Yetzer Hara, of that evil inclination, and to channel it into the good. So it's the most incredible idea. He's saying like this, that there is no such thing as good or bad traits. There is no such thing as good or bad power that God gives us. It's what we do with it that's going to define whether or not it's good or whether or not it's bad. Which means that the same, take jealousy, for example. Jealousy is normally a very negative trait. But jealousy, when utilized properly, can spur us onwards to become bigger and better people than we were. Right? Desires are neither good nor bad, right? What we do with our desire is going to define whether it's good or whether it's bad. Which means a person can have tremendous physical desires and can lead a beautiful and fulfilling married life, or a person can have tremendous physical desires and lead a debauched life. It's the same desire, it's just being channeled into something which is going to be positive as opposed to something which is going to be negative. That's what it's saying over here. When it says that we should serve God with our Yetzer Hara, with the more bad dimension of who we are, it's telling us don't try to uproot, but rather harness that power and utilize it for the good instead. I always tell people like this, I think it's a fundamental mistake that people make. People, if you're trying to become a better person, again, looking around the room, there's not too much evidence of this, but maybe you know somebody who wants to become a better person. I don't know, but if you're trying to become a better person, what should you do? Very often people make the mistake of thinking that they've got bad traits and they need to uproot those traits. They've got to get rid of them. If they get rid of those if they can break that trait, then they'll become a better person. I think that 99 times out of 100, that's not true. Which means 99 times out of 100, what a person really needs to do is a person needs to recognize what their traits are and work with inside of who they are. Right? So if you've got somebody who is very impetuous, so to decide that they don't want to be impetuous anymore, well, that's a very noble decision to make, but it's probably not going to change the person's personality at all. So what do? You have to learn how to utilize your impetuosity for the good, right? And how to learn how to control it a little bit, rather than to imagine that you can wake up one morning and you'll just you won't be the same as you were. You won't be impetuous anymore. It's the same with all of these traits that we've got. You know, if a person is an angry person, it's very unlikely that their basic fundamental character is going to change. What we've got to learn is how to control the various characteristics. That way, a person can become a better person, a person can become a kinder, gentler, more thoughtful person with inside of who he is. Not trying to be somebody else altogether, not trying to step outside of the persona that God gave him, but rather to work with inside of what God has given him to become the best person that he can become. You know, there's a medrash, a medrash Rabbi in Kohelet Rabbi, which says like this. It's a very, very, very famous medrash. It says, Mi sheyesh lo mana, if somebody has 100, so the nature of human beings is that you want to have 200.
Won't be happy with 20.
Huh?
Won't be happy with 20.
It says the medrash, if you've got 200, you want 400, right? It's an interesting thing. It's human nature. Why are we never happy with what we've got? Right? If you've got, Misha Yesh the mono whatever time, so he gets his 200, now he's not happy with his 200 anymore because now he wants to have 400. First of all, there's a very interesting insight. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, the late Rosh Hashiva of the Mir, used to say like this: you notice that your dream is getting further away. Which means when you've got 100, you just need another 100 to get to your dream. But when you've got 200, then you need 200 to get to your dream. And if you've got 400, you need another 400 to get to 800. And it's getting, the more you've got, the further and further away what you want is getting. But on top of that, what's the idea? Why did God create us in a way that we are full of desire for things that we don't have? So the answer, of course, is very simple, because the desire, that desire to have more is neither good nor bad. The desire to have more is just raw material. What am I going to do with that desire is going to define whether it's going to be good or whether it's going to be bad, which means I can channel my desire for more into the world of mitzvahs, for example. The same way that if I've got 100, I want 200. If I've done one mitzvah, I want to do another mitzvah. And if I've done 2 mitzvahs, I want to do 4 mitzvahs. And that desire, it's the same desire. It's just one desire is pulling me in one direction and one desire is pulling me in the other direction. But it's exactly the same thing. Right? A person can take the desire to always want more. There's certain kids, they're never happy. Whatever you give them, they're not happy. They want to have more and more of whatever they've just been given, and they're never looking at what they've got. They're always looking at what they don't have. How does that translate into something positive? So when you're a kid, it can be very frustrating. It's frustrating for the parent, and it's frustrating for the kid as well. But if you take a look, studies that have been done of people who are running enormous companies and fueling economies all around the world, normally these are very driven people. And whatever they've got, it's not enough. I mean, what possesses somebody who's got $100 million to want to carry on going to work every day? Like at what point do you have enough? At what point is it okay to say, you know what, I'm going to take it easy? Most of these people, they never do, because they're driven. And their drive is fueling the economy, and their drive is giving livelihood to hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people are getting livelihoods from the businesses that these people have established. Yeah.
So you know how you said that rather than try and change certain personality traits, you should try to work within the existing framework? So you know how we inherit some character traits from our parents, right? Some positive, some negative. So say, take a negative trait, for instance. Wouldn't you want to eradicate that trait as much as possible rather than work within the framework for fear that history could possibly repeat itself?
Yeah. I think the question over here is what do we mean by eradicate? Which means the trait.
Correct.
To correct, which means I don't think eradicate is the right way of looking at it. Which means if a person imagines that they're going to be able to eradicate a personality trait that they've got or they received genetically. I don't know. Is that, I mean, a person receives it genetically. How's he going to get rid of it? Right? However, what the correct way to deal with it is to work out how it can be utilized for the good. Right? Which means that, again, a person who is passionate about everything is sometimes a person who's not always in control of his temper, right? But it's possible to take that sense of passion and to direct it into positive things. Right? We've all come across people that are doing incredible things here in the world. Right? They've established the most unbelievable things in the world, whether they're Jewish or not. It doesn't make any difference. Jewish, not Jewish, and these are always very passionate people. They believe absolutely in what they're doing, and they're able to change things, and they're able to make the world a better place because of that passion that they're pouring into the world. I think the idea of saying, look, I have this, and from now on I don't want to be like this anymore, and therefore I'm going to change. I'm going to take that and uproot it and get rid of it. I don't know. It sounds very nice. I just don't think that that's practical. Which means we're better off being realistic with what I've got. Right? Somebody, for example, somebody who's a very passionate person is not going to wake up one morning and be, completely passive. It doesn't work like that. So the question over here is how can I use that passion in a positive way instead of in a negative way? You wanted to say something?
Yeah. So I've spoken to a few from religious millionaires, you want to call it, and I asked them, like, okay, you have so much money, why do you go to work?
Good question.
He said the answer one of them gave me, it was like interesting. He's like, I don't enjoy. I mean, I have enough money for me and my children, but I enjoy doing the business. I enjoy making deals. I enjoy meeting with clients. I enjoy selling. These things give me pleasure. For him, it wasn't maybe he was lying. I don't know. For him, it wasn't the money. It was.
Good. I think that's very possible. I think a person gets to a certain level of wealth where the money has very little. That exactly how many dollars there are has very little meaning anymore. Whether you're worth 40 million or 80 million or $1 billion, right? So, $1 billion, maybe that's not fair because people want to get into the billionaires club, right? So they can say they've got $1 billion, but when a person's got an awful lot of money, they're not doing this anymore necessarily for the money itself. The money doesn't really mean very much to them anymore. They've got everything that they could ever possibly want. It could be the drive. They enjoy the negotiations. They enjoy doing the business. That gives them the drive, right? It could be utilizing the money to fund all different kinds of philanthropic things. That's their motivation for going into work, right? There are all different kinds of things. I spoke to somebody once who was a very wealthy fellow in London. And I asked him why, I said, like, well, at what point are you going to slow down? He told me something very interesting. He said, I wouldn't mind, slowing down a little bit. He says, but I've got an office full of workers. He says, and it's my responsibility to them to give them their salaries. He says, if I slow down, then that's going to have a negative impact on their income at some point. So maybe that's another insight into why some people never seem to want to slow down, because of their responsibility to other people. It's a big responsibility. Somebody who's running an office and he's got 10, 20, 100, 500 people working for him. He's got to be concerned for all of these people to make sure that they're getting paid. The desire is there. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I think I would imagine if you stop each very wealthy person and ask them why they're still doing what they're doing, that you'll probably get a lot of different reasons. Right? Yeah.
I remember years ago I was reading about how, and this was at a time when most people, they'd begin a career, they'd come out of college and go to join a company, and that's it. It's very likely that for their entire career, that's it. This story was about motivating people, under those conditions. And they found that a lot of people, after a while, when they get, every now and then a promotion or a salary increase because of the cost of living or anything, that affects income, that everybody, they didn't have to have 80 million or 50 million in the bank. It was anybody. It was a source that people, they outgrow. It no longer motivates, no matter what they do. And so then they would come up with corner offices or the quality of the carpet in the office, or who has the coat rack next to the door. All these other things that
hierarchy, right? These are superficial hierarchies. They did a study in England for businesses that the most successful businesses long term were the ones that gave share options to their workers. Which means include everybody, even the cleaning stuff. Everybody had share options, and those were the most successful businesses because the minute you've now got a vested interest in that business, it's a part of you, and you are a part of it, and everybody's now working harder to try to make the business succeed even better, and that's a much greater motivation than whether you get the corner office or whether you don't. I think anyway. My father, Alav Shalom, he told me a story. He once worked for a very powerful personality in England, and there was somebody. The business was growing by leaps and bounds, and there was somebody who wanted a rise. One of the directors actually kept badgering for a rise, and he kept pushing him off. And one day, my father was sitting in the office of his boss. And the secretary phoned through to say that this director was waiting outside. So my father got up to go, and his boss told him no. He says, "Sit down." He says, "I want you to watch this." And it was a very big office, and my father sat. There was a sofa at the back. He sat at the back, and this fellow came in, and the desk at the front, and the director comes and sits down, and he starts making his pitch that he wants a raise, and he thinks he's worth more. And my father told me that the boss, put on this rather soulful look on his face, and he says, times are very tight right now. He said the business has been expanding. It was unbelievable. Like every week they were moving into bigger and bigger premises. And he says it's very tight right now. He says, but he says here's what I think I can do. He says I think we can probably afford to give you wall-to-wall carpeting in your office. And the fellow stopped and he says, "Really?" He says, "Well, what kind?" So immediately, my father said, immediately the boss says, "Well, not the highest level, of course. Obviously, even in carpeting, there's hierarchy." And he said, "But you can." He says, "Go to the carpeting department and tell them that you want level number 2, and you choose the color you want and put it in." And he said this fellow left the room. He was so happy, and my father's boss turned to him and he says to him, as the fellow closed the door, he says, "There goes a fool." What did he sell out for? He could have got a rise. If he would have just pushed a little bit more, he would have got it, right? But what did he sell out for in the end? Some ridiculous little status symbol that has no meaning whatsoever, because in a few months' time they're going to move into another premises anyway, and that carpet will get left behind. Right? We do tend to sell out for we do tend to sell out for ridiculous things, that's for sure. Sometimes it's a carpet, sometimes it's something else, sometimes it's a piece of cake in the morning, whatever it is that gets us going. Yeah, but that's the cholavavacha, to take our personality, to take our traits, and to try to channel them into a more positive dimension. And then it says uvachol nafshecha. That bit's easy. Right? We should be prepared to dedicate our souls to God. That shouldn't be such a difficult thing to do. God gave us our soul to begin with, right? So hopefully it shouldn't be so complicated to say, "Here, take my soul, I'll give it back to you." The last of the 3 things that I mentioned over here is v'chol mo'idecha, which is with all your resources. It's the most fascinating idea over here. The rabbis point out that things are going up in levels. So we start off with the easiest level, is v'chol levavecha, with all of our heart, and then with all of our soul, which is a deeper level, and then uvachol mo'idecha, with all of your material abundance, that's the highest level of all. Now, if I were to ask you, myself included, we would probably all say it should be the other way around, no? That's, you know, the physical and then get to the spiritual, and that's a better order of doing things. But over here, it's working backwards in a certain way. It's ending up over Chol Moedecha. Why is that? Because the hardest thing of all that we have to do is to give away our physicality, our material wealth. That's the hardest thing that a person can do. Somebody once mentioned a very interesting phrase. It's easier to die sanctifying God's name than it is to live sanctifying God's name. Or to put it perhaps into an easier way to understand it, it's easier to fast to sanctify God's name than it is to eat to sanctify God's name. Which is on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, when everyone's in the synagogue and everyone's fasting and everybody's in a sense, you feel a certain sense of, you know, if the synagogue you're in is doing it the right way, there's a certain sense of urgency over here. You know, we've got to get something done. We've got to become better. We've got to become bigger than we were. So it's not such a big deal to tap into that feeling, right? To become one with that particular feeling, because we're sacrificing. We're not eating. We're not drinking. We're in the synagogue. We're trying to follow what's going on. A lot of sacrifices going into this. However, to eat, like on Friday night, to eat the Friday night meal, to eat it in a state of sanctity, to eat it in a state of holiness, that's a lot more difficult to do. So to live what's called Al Kiddush Hashem, to live in a state of sanctity by sanctifying God's name, is far, far harder to do. And I once, giving charity is pretty fundamental inside of Jewish life, and giving charity means that it's difficult for everybody. That the thing that connects giving charity connects everybody together is that it's difficult for everybody to give. You can be a real wealthy guy and you've got $1 million to give away. Or you can be a not so wealthy guy and you've got $10,000 to give away. But for each one, what they're giving away right now, that's difficult for them. You know, the rich guy's looking at the poor guy and he's saying, wow, that guy's only got $10,000 to give away. For him, it's easy. And the poor guy's looking at the rich guy and saying, gosh, I got to give away $10,000 is a fortune for me. This guy's giving away $1 million. You know why? Because it's easy for him. Right? But the emes is, it's difficult for everybody. This idea of giving away our physicality, being prepared to give away our physicality in order to draw closer to God, is something which is truly very difficult to do. So I think we're going to stop over here, Mitzvah Hashem. But you know, if anybody here is inspired enough to want to give away their material physicality, so I might know somebody who is prepared to help them out.
20% is 20%.
And 20% of nothing is
20% of something.
Okay, we're going to stop over here.